Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
proporre con la propria vita
esiste anche grazie a te.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this meeting about the world after liberalism. I am Mattia Ferraresi. I am a journalist of Domani newspaper, and I will introduce you our guests in a second, and I will make a brief introduction to tell you more about the topic we're going to discuss today. So, our liberal system is in a deep crisis, so the world, global, geopolitical events are a proof of that. And I think that you all noticed the crisis that is underway, that is in full swing. But what seems to be in a deep crisis is the very same notion of the person, and as a consequence of society and of the state that supports the liberal system. So it's not just about the crisis of a specific social and political model and a specific social and political system that seemed to be inevitable after the end of the Cold War. So people then talked about the end of history, so the end of any alternatives to the liberal approach. But I think that instead, what is at stake is the notion of the state, of the market, and of the person, what shaped our current conception of modernity. I want to mention a thinker that you all know very well here, Don Luigi Giussani, in a very important book, maybe not quoted enough, so Religious Consciousness in Modern Man. He talks about an anthropology of dissolution, putting that at the heart of modernity. And I think that the religious awareness in modern man links up with the message of Pope Leo XIV that we heard this morning. And he criticized specific idolatry-based development models. And by saying so, it refers to the need of a great cultural conversion. So, that said, we're here to start a debate on these big issues. And these issues are inevitable and urgent to be answered to. Before giving the floor to our guests and before introducing them to you, I want to say another thing. There are at least two big ways to tackle the crisis of liberalism. First of all, we could focus on the threats, the external threats to the system. And among them, we may find all those cultural and political movements that somehow could be called as populist movements. So with all the isms that you like. The second way we could look at the crisis of liberalism instead is based on the internal contradictions, so the very same contradictions of liberalism. And so we could ask ourselves whether the crisis we're going through is nothing but the natural outcome of liberalism and its failure. So I would like now to open the debate with the two great observers of our modernity. I'm very happy to have such high-flying speakers and guests on such urgent topics. We have the great honor to have for the second time at the meeting. Well, the first one was in 2020, so it was from remote, but we're very happy to have him in person. Patrick Deneen, science, politics professor at Notre University in Indiana, author of two very important books on this topic. The first one is Why Liberalism Failed, The second one is a regime change. Doesn't need any translation. And he will be in conversation with Joseph Weiler. And as you know, he's a law professor at the New York University, senior fellow at the Center for European Studies of Harvard, and most of all, is a great friend of the meeting. I think he has been a guest for more than 20 years, so probably requires less presentation. So please welcome both of them with a great round of applause. Thank you.
Non mi resta che lasciare la parola, abbiamo strutturato così.
Right, so first you will have both the opportunity to make a short speech to set the framework and help better understand the debate in order to learn something and delve into the topic. And then I will ask you a couple of questions. So I would like to ask Professor Deneen to be the first one. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you to the organizers for sponsoring this conversation. I thought I should begin with maybe a definition of terms. What is liberalism? And one of the problems of defining this term is that if you have 5 political scientists in a room and you ask them, what is liberalism, you'll end up with 20 definitions. But let me offer at least one way of thinking about what is liberalism. Broadly, liberalism proposes a fundamental change in how we think of our lives and how we think of ourselves as bound together in our lives. Broadly, liberalism as a development in early modernity was an effort to move the world from one in which every aspect of our lives is defined by inheritance, that which we receive, to one in which every aspect of our lives is defined by individual choice, the choices we make, free of inheritance, free of impositions, or what come to be seen as impositions. Now, on the one hand, as an Irish Catholic, this has been of tremendous benefit to me personally. I might have been picking potatoes in a field in Southern Ireland if I were simply living according to inheritance, but instead I'm a full professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. This is, of course, in my mind, something of a benefit, not to be picking potatoes. On the other hand, I think we can see many of the costs of this shift. These costs include requiring the weakening of formative institutions that once were the sources of our inheritance. We would put in the first place the weakening of family, a source of concern for many here perhaps, the weakening of community, the weakening of the idea of nation, and the weakening of our sense of being members of the church. Indeed, this project of liberalism becomes a radical project over time, one that begins at first with a kind of soft weakening of our allegiance to these institutions, choices that are made by individuals, whether they will remain in their particular family, their particular community, their particular nation, but increasingly becomes an aggressive project of actively weakening these institutions, and especially those institutions that have proven the most resistant to this remaking. And as especially the family and the church become the remaining institutions of inheritance, they have become increasingly the active targets of the liberal state in the active effort to undermine their continued influence and strength. So I've spent the last few years writing various critiques of liberalism as a fundamentally radical project. and one that ultimately undermines itself. It undermines, in some ways, its own presuppositions. And now, having made these arguments for the last, so now 7 or 8 years, it's my experience that liberals, those who defend liberalism, will often make one main charge against people like me, which is that people like me making these arguments are nostalgists. We're engaged in a project of deep and profound nostalgia for a time and a way of life that has rightly gone out of existence. But I want to make a counter-argument today that the most nostalgic people that I encounter today in these various debates are liberals. It's the liberals who are the nostalgists, pining themselves for a lost age, and an age that arguably can never come back. It can't come back because liberalism has made that impossible. Often the concrete destination of those nostalgic longings are those years of seeming American hegemony and of liberal ascendancy. We can think in particular of arguments that were made by someone like Francis Fukuyama in his famous essay, The End of History, in 1989, which argued that liberalism was the only political order that, as far as the eye could see, would remain the dominant political form of organization for the rest of human history. It's those years in which there was a kind of American and liberal ascendancy that liberals now look back to with a kind of nostalgic fondness. They look back, for example, to the 1980s and the rise of neoliberal economics, kind of Reaganomics, the growing forms of economic globalism, the removal of trade barriers, the outsourcing of low-paid jobs and labor overseas, of factories being moved from the American heartland where I live to China, among other places. The rise of finance as one of the main activities of economic life. And of course, as part of this, the belief that borders were essentially arbitrary. They were simply lines on a map that ought to fundamentally mean nothing. Liberals also look back fondly to the 1990s, the high watermark of liberal internationalism, or what's called at times the rule-based order. This rule-based order was, of course, supported and led by American military, economic, and even social arrangements and pressure, which sought to shape a world as a liberal global order. Indeed, in his second inaugural address, George W. Bush, who was then, of course, leading the war in Iraq, argued that the project of American liberalism and global liberalism should seek to eliminate tyranny from the world, to actively use every source possible, including military, to eliminate all remaining forms of tyranny. This would be a very big ambition. And of course, this aim and ambition was reflected in the U.S. confidence that accompanied its invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and the expansion of NATO to the very doorstep of Russia. And in the 2000s, liberals look back fondly to a time of a kind of social revolution, especially an expansion of the sexual revolution, now to define the very meaning and nature of what marriage was. The complementarity of human sexuality was now seen as fundamentally disposable in how marriage was understood, and instead, choice and love should dominate how we understand our relationships and its official recognition by the state. And so the limitations imposed by human biology were not to matter anymore. Again, the freedom of choice, of individual choice, was to predominate. Now, if we look back at those decades of liberal confidence, at the end of history, What we see already is that the seeds of liberalism's undoing, its crisis, were already sown in those years. And in those years, already we could see the radical and revolutionary seeds of liberalism reflected in each of those commitments. Economic neoliberalism, of course, gave rise to radical economic inequality. Much of that experienced generationally, with younger people now shut out of opportunity and older people enjoying far greater comfort and wealth. We saw economic precarity experienced by larger and larger numbers of our fellow citizens. We saw, of course, widespread financial irresponsibility, leading to the economic crisis of 2008. And, of course, what led to the widespread rejection of globalization, including the rejection of open border policies. In the second instance, the liberal international order showed itself, in fact, to be an overextension of imperial ambitions. Ignominious United States and coalition military withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan were simply signs of the weakness of liberalism and the impossibility of liberalism to impose its will everywhere. And of course, more recently still, Russia's assertion of its sphere of influence in the West is revealing the extent to which liberalism finds itself once again in a competition of power and not simply ideological supremacy. And lastly, in the sphere and domain of social and sexual revolution, we discover that the radical extension of the claim that our sexuality was merely a matter of choice and human sovereignty led especially, or one of the ways in which it was manifest, was the rise of the claims of transsexuality, its increasing claim to be a normal way, and indeed a preferred way, of how we understand our sexuality, simply a matter of choice, not a matter of nature. The prospect of biological men appearing and competing in what were formerly women's spaces, whether sports or other spaces, or even requiring the forcible removal of children from families by the state pursuing and defending transition of young minors, has resulted in a major blowback. And it seems to me one of the first times that the sexual revolution has been at least temporarily halted. Now, I've mentioned that liberal nostalgia is one of the most pronounced forms of nostalgia that I encounter today, and that nostalgia seeks to reach back to a time before these radical extensions of liberalism's own radical conclusions. That is to say, what the implicit or even explicit claim of these nostalgists is that these radical developments from within liberalism are accidental and not essential, that they were merely contingent and not inevitable. Such nostalgists long for a more moderate liberalism, one that preceded liberalism's own self-destructive radical developments. This more moderate kind of liberalism was cognizant of economic solidarity. This included the recognition and respect toward labor unions and toward communal economic norms. This placed a primacy on community and nation against simply the claims of globalism. And of course, this liberalism, for a time at least, existed amid widespread acceptance and even recommendation of traditional sexual mores rooted in marriage, family, children, and community.
You might want to slow down a little bit, maybe. Thank you.
Liberal nostalgists then claim that these prevailing conditions constituted true liberalism. But evidence that we see all around us runs to the contrary. True liberalism undermined and ultimately frontally attacked all of the traditional and cultural forms that are contrary to liberalism. And anyone who attended a university during these years of the high watermark of liberalism knows exactly what I'm speaking of. All of those things that I'm calling moderate liberalism were under attack already in those years of moderate liberalism as being arbitrary constraints, nation, family, kind of limitations on the globalized world. It's liberal nostalgists then who wish to go back before a time of the recent liberal revolution that has unfolded during the last 50 years. They long for a world and for institutions that liberalism itself undermined and even destroyed, and which, I want to submit, it is itself incapable of reviving or reinstituting. So we meet here today to talk about a liberalism in crisis, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. It lived up to its own ideals, and thereby destroyed the older pre-liberal institutions and practices that today's liberal nostalgists long to return to, but predictably can find no way back amid the wasteland that it has created. And so we are faced with a challenge that every civilization at some point comes to face. Is it possible to restore that which was lost? Is it possible to revive that which no longer exists? Once you have destroyed an institution and a culture and practices, can they be revived? And in this question and in this challenge, I come to you with only a question, and anxiety, and misgivings. I don't know, but I do know one thing. I am certain of one thing, that the liberal order itself cannot revive what it has destroyed. Under the prevailing conditions and aims of liberalism, there is no prospect for the restoration of a flourishing West. Its fundamental commitment to radical individual freedom makes this restoration impossible. And so for this reason, I have now become associated with what is a still nascent, but nevertheless a growing effort to think about a form of post-liberalism, what comes after liberalism, and a humane post-liberalism that seeks perhaps to rebuild, to revive, and to recreate the kinds of practices and institutions that liberalism has undermined. Post-liberalism, as I would describe it, begins with a rejection of the anthropology of liberalism that was mentioned by Mattia at the beginning. Human beings are not radically individual selves who are oriented simply to autonomous, choosing individual selfhood. It rejects then the idea of liberalism that has resulted in the crisis that we see. But nor is it a nostalgia for pre-liberalism. And this is why I think the word post-liberalism is self-consciously not nostalgic, but seeks to look forward. What can be built out of the wreckage that we see around us? What are the kinds of institutions and practices that are necessary to human flourishing? Now, the development of cultural practices, what I believe and I understand communal and liberation to be especially dedicated to, are necessary but not sufficient in the pursuit of a revivification of the West. There also need to be political efforts and policies that favor the reinstitutionalization and the revivification of these practices and institutions. So this is self-consciously then post-liberal, aware of where we are, of what time it is. Not simply attempting to go back, but going forward from where we are now, recognizing that we live in a different world than we did in the 50s, or the late 1900s, or the 1800s, or the 1500s. We live in a world that's technologically rather different, that is more global, one in which we have experienced extraordinary personal liberation from inheritance. So a post-liberation liberalism recognizes all of these features, but then begins to inquire into how it is that we can shift our political, social, and economic policies to strengthen what is necessary for human flourishing. And here's the challenge. There is no model for this that has existed before liberalism. I'm often asked, what date do you want to go back to? There is no date I want to go back to. We can only go forward, and we can only conceive a new future. And this requires us to address frontally the consequences of liberalism while refashioning the older teachings of a pre-liberal time to assist us in building that future. The foci need to be how to reconceive, if possible revive, but also reconstruct, construct in new ways, the core institutions and practices of human flourishing in a modern context. Family, community, nation, and faith. How do we conceive and organize an economy, an education, cultural institutions, and finally our politics that will support and foster these ancient institutions and practices in a fundamentally new, modern, and post-liberal form? That's the question I've presented to myself and I present to you as one worthy of our exploration and indeed our efforts. Thank you.
Credo che l'intervento di Deneen.
Well, I think that your speech raised in me so many questions. Thank you very much. So I give the floor straight away to Professor Weiler for your speech.
Grazie.
Thank you. First of all, what a pleasure to be here with you again. Over the last 23 years, I missed just one meeting. Nobody's perfect, by the way. I'd like to take a few minutes to speak about something that is far away from what we're talking about, because there are moments in public life that require somebody to speak. And so we cannot be silent seeing what is happening in the Middle East. And I'd like to express my opinion, my attitude, and my pain and suffering from what is happening. And I'd like to read a passage from the Genesis, chapter 18, because well, there are always deep truth there. Right, I'm reading. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and so the nation will rise big and large, and so all the nations of earth will be righteous. I chose it in order to make him oblige his sons and his family after him to observe the way of the Lord." which is the way of the Lord, to act with fairness, and to implement the right. The second passage is a few lines after. Right, my Italian is not that good. Abraham got close to him and said to the Lord, "Really? Are you going to destroy the righteous with impious? Maybe there are just 50 righteous. Do you really want to destroy them? And so what are you going to do? What about the 50 righteous who are there?" And so far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? So that deep lesson applies to both sides now in this terrible conflict. It applies to October the 7th, and it applies to the Israeli response. I read again, I keep reading. So, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Thank you. If I may, I would say, Abraham, Abraham, where are you today? But now, let's go straight back to our topic today. So we are living in an era of polarizations. Either you are with us or you are against us. That's the idea. And often, I'm being considered too conservative for liberals and too liberal for conservative people. So maybe today nobody will like me. But it's a great honor for me to share the stage with Professor Deneen. He wrote 2 books that are 2 milestones. One has been published in Italian, and please look for it and read it. It's a fundamental read. I share many of the things that you said, but there are things that I see differently. And in order to underscore the differences, I'd like to make a distinction that, to me at least, is very important. I'd like to make a distinction between liberalism as an organizational premise of the state, talking about liberal democracy, and the belief of an individual or of a group of people, liberal or not liberal. I think that this is a fundamental distinction to me. Remember what Churchill said about democracy. It's a very famous idea. Many forms of government have been tried and have been tried in a world of sin and pain. Nobody thinks that democracy is perfect and flawless. Democracy can be also considered as the worst form of government, apart from all the others that have been tried and tested. Well, in organizational terms, in terms of organization of the state, we could say the same thing about liberal democracy. In other words, there's plenty of flaws, but we should not generalize and simplify. And in this sense, maybe there are not so many differences between us, because I don't live that nostalgia. So what is the origin of modern liberal democracies? I think that there are 3 main origins. First of all, the war of religions of the 1800s and 1900s, when Protestants and Catholics used to make war and to kill each other. And then absolute monarchies. So individuals were just servants to the power, and the confessional Catholic state. These are the three pillars, the backbone of liberal democracy that led to the birth of liberal democracies. But now, liberal democracies are trying to create societies, communities of people, and I underscore this, community. And these communities should be made of people with very different opinions, clashing opinions, but these people should be able to live together. This is the ultimate goal of any liberal democracy. And this is, I think, very relevant today, more than ever. A second principle is about limiting public power versus individuals. So there is no public power of any kind, of any form, that can do anything, that is almighty. I mean, there should be limits and restrictions, and that leads to the fundamental rights of people. And this is something that is irrepressible. To me, this is the basic pillar of liberal democracy, regardless of the kind of organization a state has. Many of the problems that is that Deneen or Deneen? Deneen. That Professor Deneen said, well, I share what he said about the problems and the crises, and I said it many, many times, also here at the meeting. The emphasis that to me is exaggerated on rights, and also the total lack of a debate on duties. So rights without duties is a betrayal. And also this absolute autonomy. So everything is about individual choices that seems to prevail over anything else on common good and communal well-being and prosperity. And also I share what you said about the weakening of family, of fundamental social institutions that are so important for us as social beings. But then I have a different take on something else. To me, the reason for this is not liberalism, is secularism. That is why I'm pretty pessimistic about the opportunity and the possibility to find a new way to fix the situation. To me, I mean, the blame is to put on secularism. When you go to church and listen to the preaching of the priest, he always talks about duties towards the other, towards our Lord, towards society. So, but those talks about duties have disappeared from contemporary public life. Well, if any European politician would like to copy Kennedy in the 60s when he said, don't ask yourselves what the state can do for you, but what you can do for the state, well, that politician would lose the election, because this idea of having duties and not just rights has completely vanished. Secondly, you know better than anybody else that religion is a very strong bond that creates communities. Religion is not something individual. It's not about the individual. It's about a community and being part of a community. This is very clear, both in Old and in the New Testament. It's about the people. It's about you, plural, and not just you, singular. Now, what happened? To me, secularism can be the explanation, can explain at least partially what happened. In Europe today, there are two main religions, a majority religion and a minority religion. The majority religion is secularism. The minority religion is Christianity. What is happening in our societies then? Secularism is considered as a religion, and the state is really copying the confessional Catholic state. But now the only difference is that the official religion, let's say, is secularism. So that's the root cause of the crisis we're experiencing. But why do I define myself as a pessimist? Because I think that in terms of organization of the state, we should stick to a liberal democracy. Let's take Ratzinger. Ratzinger was not a liberal person in terms of personal belief. We religious people, well, we can't be liberal in the sense and in the way that you, Professor Deneen, explained, because we accept not autonomous sort of ethics. But when it comes to the organization of the state, Ratzinger stated the need of a neutral state, let's say a liberal state, in order not to force, in order to allow to professors like me, like Professor Deneen, to communal liberation, to get organized and be free to speak. So when I say that, to me, the root cause of the social crisis we're experiencing is secularization, is also due to the fact that I do not see any public authority that could be able to de-secularize our society. This is not because I'm liberal, but because I am a religious person. We learned that in Dignitatis Humana. It's a kind of development that was not reached by the Jews and the Muslims. So, because that sounds as a contradiction to the willingness of God. Ratzinger said that true religion, real religion, can exist only in a condition of freedom, political freedom and individual freedom. The Lord offers us something, and only as free people we can choose whether to follow the Lord or not. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Weiler. Thank you. Your speech raises so many questions too. Well, we don't have so much time, but you can try to share more ideas. So I'll go back to you, Professor Deneen. Going back to something you said and asking you a question. Actually, it's two questions merged in one. So something you said is very important, is pivotal. So liberalism failed because it succeeded. So it did its job very well. And this is a debate that is in full swing in the US, in Europe, in Italy, in Latin Europe, and also in Anglo-Saxon countries. So it's about the woke, thinking. It's a debate about the somehow stronghold of a certain narrative about equality and rights. For instance, I see that there is a consolidating trend about having liberal thinkers that define themselves as liberal, and they say that the woke thinking is a betrayal of true, real, original liberalism. But instead, Professor Deneen, you said something else. You somehow designed a different hypothesis, that that kind of thinking as well is a consequence of liberalism, is part of liberalism. So could you please elaborate more on this? First question. And second question, well, I link up to what Professor Weiler said pretty clearly. We talked about the post-liberal project, and we tried to see how this could be, which could be the features of such a project. So such a post-liberal project would end up being very similar to a confessional state or to a state that, regardless of the form, should fix through laws and institutions, setting what is good from what is wrong, imposing that. Thank you, Professor Deneen.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Weiler, for those comments. It's equally, if not more, an honor for me to be here with you, whose work I've long admired. It strikes me that Professor Weiler's response to me is, in fact, in many ways, something of an expression of the nostalgic liberalism that I was describing. And it's in the following way, that it suggests, as Mattia was just pointing to, that true liberalism has been betrayed by an aberration from liberalism, that wokeness, radical forms of liberation, of the idea that we are self-creating, independent human selves, represents a departure from basic liberal values, rather than its fulfillment. In essence, what this nostalgic argument is essentially contending is that liberalism is true in theory, but simply has been betrayed in fact. I think, in fact, one has to follow not only the evidence, but the trajectory of the theory. And if those two things coincide, then we ought to strongly be inclined to conclude, as I have certainly concluded, that what we are seeing is not a betrayal of essential liberal values, but its fulfillment. You mentioned a number of thinkers, the free press being one of them, Barry Weiss, a number of liberal thinkers who are attempting to push back against wokeness by an appeal to the classical liberal values of openness, the free exchange of ideas, a society filled with conflicting voices. But as it turns out, the architects of liberal democracy, including John Stuart Mill, the great defender of free speech, of the ideal of toleration, the toleration of different views, he himself understood that there had to be a limit on how much freedom could be allowed. And the limit that he described was a limit upon people who maintained what he regarded as backward conservative views, what he called the despotism of custom. Those who were under the despotism of custom could not be tolerated. These viewpoints were not acceptable in a liberal society. Now, how is it that those who are arguing that classical liberalism will save us from wokeness can draw such a conclusion when, in fact, at the very outset of liberalism, its architects understood that it would seek to shape and form and create a society that would overturn all forms of tradition and custom and those ways of life that I think Professor Weiler and I both value and both prize. So the difficult and the challenging question that we are presented with is the only alternative between some form of a radically woke, new confessional state, as you put it, in which wokeness becomes a new religion. And it has its heresies, and it has its heretics, and it has its creed, and it has its flag, and it has forms of allegiance that one has to proclaim. It has all the earmarks of a kind of established religion. Or is the only alternative a different established religion? A confessional state, the old Catholic confessional state. And this is where I think the idea of a post-liberalism has to understand that we are not in a condition or situation in which the confessional Catholic state is likely to find its way back into realization, as much as some people maybe in this room or maybe people that I know wish that to be the case. But aren't there gradations along the way, forms of public Christianity, including crucifixes in classrooms, including recognition of public Catholic Christian holidays, which is still the case, I believe, in Italy. You get Christmas off, right? The recognition that we still have in our society that has become a kind of afterthought in many cases, but could be revivified by a kind of public commitment. But more than that, precisely by strengthening those practices and institutions where we are taught duty and not merely individual rights. What of a politics, not only a cultural renewal, but also a political effort to strengthen family, where we learn first as children and then as parents, we learn duty, and we learn commitment, and we learn gratitude, and we learn inheritance. And what of the strengthening of communities against the threats it receives, not only from progressive, woke causes, but from the market, and the way that the market tends to weaken communal ties and communal forms of membership, and to strengthen ideals of the nation as not just an arbitrary place, but a place with history and memory, in which also requires certain kinds of duties and sacrifices. And if in the learning of duties and obligations that we have outside of ourselves, if we found at the end of that people would rediscover that we are not merely self-makers, but we are ourselves created, and then we begin to ask questions about our Creator, would that not be a desirable outcome? So perhaps the path is not by some kind of imposition of a confessional state, but the cultivation of a society and a polity and an economics of mutual duty and the recognition of inheritance, and not simply the articulation of our individual rights and our capacity for self-creation.
Grazie mille, Professor Deneen. Naturalmente con la massima libertà.
Professor Weiler, feel free to respond to the ideas of Professor Deneen if you want, but I go back to what you said before. You also raised many interesting ideas, including, for instance, the relationship between secularism and liberalism. Well, that would lead us in so many interesting places. But you mentioned the word neutrality. It's a very interesting category. Well, in the classic view of John Rawls' liberal pluralism, that probably was the most important thinker in 1900. Well, he said roughly, so the public space, the state, is a neutral place about what is good and what is wrong in life. Well, that should be a neutral space regulated by some commonly shared rules, and by rules, by laws, by customs, by practices, but basically it's deprived of any biased content. So would you like to elaborate a bit more on this, please? Because I think that maybe this is one of the most controversial issues. For instance, post-liberals say, oh, be careful. Well, that idea would be true if that space was really neutral, but is not neutral. It already has a content, an implicit anthropology, a certain conception of the state, of the individual. So that space is not neutral at all. It has a content, even if it claims to be neutral. Sorry if I'm building a whole argument on this word, on one word, but I think it's interesting to follow on this. Thank you. It's a good example because, well, there are two conceptions of neutrality. One is wrong, and one is less wrong, let's say. Is more right. Let's take public education. In the French system and in the American system, these two systems, make confusion between neutrality and secularism. They say, well, so if the state should be neutral, and so forcing a crucifix in a classroom is a violation of that neutrality. This is what was ruled in Strasbourg. But there is something more dangerous, that this sort of wrong idea of neutrality is not real. So we can finance lay education, but not religious education. This is another consequence of this thinking. But there could be an alternative to this neutrality theory in the public education system. In the Netherlands and in the UK, we have a different approach. In the UK, they have a different idea, and they say the state has to be neutral, but today's society is marked by a divide, not between Catholics and Protestants, but instead is among lay religious people. How is it so that the state finances schools for the lay community so that the parents do not have to pay for the education of their children, but instead the parents that want their children to get some religious education have to go to other schools, so that are private schools and not financed by the state. So in the UK and in the Netherlands, in the name of neutrality, the state finances lay public schools, lay Anglican schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, even Muslim schools, because this is the real cleavage. Because if the cleavage is specifically among and between religious people, a really neutral state cannot have preferences, cannot be biased. So we see that states that consider themselves a liberal have different practices. So to me, the French and American model is a betrayal of the real, authentic neutrality, state neutrality. Instead, the Netherlands, the Dutch and the British systems are a real implementation of such neutrality. And you were right in underscoring this notion of neutrality, because often, not always and not everywhere, but often, in the name of neutrality, people impose secular norms and rules. So, do you want to be secular? Well, it is your right, but the state cannot oblige people to be secular. The state should not, never, ever force people to be secular, as it can't force people to be religious. So that's why neutrality is so important. If I can, I would like to add another word, because if my analysis has some good grounds when I say that our social crisis is mostly due to secularism, is because secularism has been adopted as a religion, and little by little, this is becoming something conventional. But on top of that, we always tend, when we see something evil, to put the blame on somebody. You are to blame, but we never put the blame on ourselves. So allow me to say, and I hope I won't insult or offend anybody, but which was the most successful period of the Christian Revolution? The first 400 years. Because at that time, I mean, it was the evangelization process was a big success against the Roman state. Europe became Christian thanks to this process of proselytism, of evangelization, and that came from the people. And then when Constantine adopted Christianity as the religion, well, to me, that was a fundamental religious mistake. So putting the state as a guarantee of, the religious system, because this is not good. It is up to us. It is up to us through examples, through testimonies. It is not up to the state to say so. It is not up to the state to foster the re-evangelization of the European people, because Europe has become a secular continent apart from Poland. Well, in France, only 7 to 10% of the people go to church. That marks the end of church. But we should never look away, for the people to blame. This is also our responsibility. I want to end up on a maybe controversial note with Professor Deneen. I do agree, and I also agree with the neoliberal thinkers about the limits that freedom requires. Even religious freedom must not be absolute. Well, for instance, there are restrictions about female circumcision, thanks to, but not just to, some religious rule. If you take those supporting this argument, Professor Deneen, those people may be people that say, oh, there must be limits to the freedom of expression, and so canceling is. So they adopt the same logic, putting restrictions to freedom, but the argument is the same. Then restrictions change because visions are different, but there is no easy fix to this. But this is simply to say how complex it is to accept any kind of restrictions on freedom. Who is going to fix those limits and how? That is where the debate will lie, because there is no easy answer to this. Who is going to set the limits, and which limits? Some people would certainly like to cancel both Professor Deneen and Professor Weiler too.
Certo. Professor Deneen, se vuole...
Professor Deneen, please.
Very briefly, thank you again. I think Professor Weiler made an extraordinary concession to my case. But again, it's an effort to suggest that there is a line that can be drawn between true liberalism and its false manifestation. The claim is that true liberalism is a form, the better form of neutrality, which allows us the freedom to choose our particular way of life. But its current departure from true liberalism is what he describes as secularism or wokeness or progressivism as a religion. And again, I would simply submit that the evidence is quite clear, and it has always been clear, that there is no political, social, cultural order that can be indifferent to questions of what we are as a people. It will always be more one thing than another thing. And the one thing that it is will become the dominant worldview and will eventually find its way into the social, cultural, and legal system. And that's what we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years, is liberalism becoming, in a sense, an established religion, secularism becoming an established religion. So the real question we face isn't, can we escape limits? Can we escape hard choices about what it is we value? The question is, what are those? And how do we pursue those in a way that's respectful of human beings, but recognizes there's no place where we can avoid that challenge? And the idea that we can simply live in an indifferent, neutral state, I think has been shown to be a false belief, given the evidence of the last several decades.
Un'ultima parola al professor Weiler.
Yes, we run out of time. I'd like to say something to Professor Deneen. I was very happy to make a concession to you. Well, I'm going to do something extremely vulgar because I came to the meeting in 2003 when I published my book, A Christian Europe. 3 weeks ago, I published the follow-up, Is Europe Still Christian? And I explained everything that I told you very briefly today in a more extended version. If you're going to read it, well, you will see that I make a lot of concessions to Professor Deneen on many things, not all, but on many things. It's available at the bookshop, and on Sunday I will have a signing session from noon to 2 o'clock. I'm very sad to tell you that our time is over, and I would have so many more questions to you. I'm very happy for having you as guests, because such a debate of such a high level on such topics was extremely enlightening, and this embodies the spirit of the meeting. Thank you. Please welcome and thank them too. But before giving it up for them, let's think about one thing. The meeting is possible, and such debates are possible. So such very rare things to a big effort, a common effort. So please support the meeting. And I say it very, very blatantly. So please support the meeting. And you can support the meeting through donations. There are many donating stations, all in red, with a red heart. So please donate, support the meeting. The meeting is a third sector entity, and if you donate, you can have access to tax breaks. And I'm so grateful to the meeting and for attending such a great debate. Thank you. Thank you again. Now you can give it up for our guests.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si
che
batte.
approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.